Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce and Separation Coach podcast. This week, we're talking about family split-ups, but from the children's perspective. My guest is Bella Duncan. Bella is an empowered child of divorce who's determined to make change for the better. Bella lived herself between two homes for over 20 years, and she's experienced firsthand many of the challenges that children of divorce face. Bella is now an admitted lawyer and a psychology graduate, and she works with families and professionals to provide insights into the realities of divorce, but from the perspective of the children. Thank you for joining me today, Bella.
So happy to be here, Chloe. Thanks so much for having me.
What an interesting perspective. I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about your own experience, but also about the advice you give generically to people who are going through this experience. And so really, from your standpoint, what do you think matters most to children during their parents' divorce?
Yeah, so obviously being a kid of divorce myself and having that lived experience combined with my education background, I now consider myself an advocate for kids of divorce. And my focus is really on giving light to the kids' perspective, because I think it's so important for parents and people generally to understand the role of the kid. And so one of those major things is to answer that exact question that you just asked me, Chloe.
Yeah.
So I think I like to break it down into five things, and I'm going to go into them in small detail. So number one is kids just want to be able to be a kid. This is irrespective of their parents' divorce. And that can be difficult for kids when their parents do separate, but at the end of the day, they're still a kid and they still want to do things that they want to do as a kid, and they want to, not be so impacted by their parents' divorce. That leads me into point number two, and this is something that I harp on quite frequently, is that kids don't want adult responsibilities and they don't want their happiness compromised because of their parents' divorce. That responsibility leads me into point three, which is logistics. What matters most to kids often is the logistics, whose place am I staying at? What bag do I have to pack? What clothes do I need? They want help with that, and they want that adult responsibility taken away from them, specifically around scheduling and custody and all those types of really big adult things. Number four is always conflict. Low conflict matters massively to kids, and that ties again into keeping the adult stuff between the adults. Conflict can be healthy, and it's really important that kids understand conflict is part of life, but there's a difference between healthy conflict and conflict deriving from a divorce that can be really big and nasty sometimes. So minimizing that in a child's life throughout their parents' divorce is important. And number five, finally, is reassurance. Reassurance that, one, the divorce was not the kid's fault. Number two, they are loved and cared for no matter what. And number three, that they can just be a kid despite their parents' divorce, and being reassured that their life isn't going to change, and the trajectory of their life in its entirety isn't going to change just because their parents are not together.
Those are all really good points. And I think there's two of them that kind of touch on an element that I think is really important, which is parentification, which tends to happen in divorce because for the parents, their world is being turned upside down. And actually, especially with teenagers, when they start to have their own life outside the house, that isn't really the case. Of course, it has a massive impact on them, but they still want to continue living their little life and enjoying that. And they may not want to talk about the divorce all the time, or they may just not want to feel the impact that the parents are feeling. Is that something you've seen in the past?
Oh, completely. I think with my peers, myself, I think something that adds to that is having a sibling. Parentification in my world was quite significant. Having somebody that you think you now have responsibility and care over because your parents are not able to have the mental capacity to care for that person that you love so much. As an older sibling, I find that quite often amongst amongst people generally, but specifically within my world. And that is a really difficult thing for a kid to grasp and really recognize. I don't think I understood parentification until I properly was sitting in a psychology tute learning about it. And I was like, hold on. That sounds very familiar. And, you know, there are a lot of things that kids of divorce experience, but they don't want to do the work to understand what they're experiencing because it's all very overwhelming and it's too much for you know, the life that they're meant, or that stage in life that they're currently going through.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. You know, the extra care responsibilities that can fall on the older child when their parents become single parents effectively, you know, that happens quite a lot. I also see a lot of parents who start treating their oldest child as their partner. And because they're parenting on their own, aside from the actual responsibilities of childcare, they confide in them. They start literally using them as their crutch, as they would a partner who would be, you know, an equal to be their team member through this experience. Is that one of the common mistakes you've seen as well?
Massively. And I think one of the major quotes that I get people reusing often is, your kid is not your therapist. And it sounds harsh. But like I said at the start of this interview, Chloe, I am an advocate for the kid, and I am unapologetically an advocate for the kid. And, you know, in my experience, you know, being up early hours of the morning, basically being a counsellor or feeling like, you know, a therapist at a very young age is not, you know, a poor reflection on my parents, but more an indication. And I think what I like to do is offer a solution that you need professional help, and your kid is not that professional help. Absolutely. And self-care is not selfless. Helping yourself is helping your kid. But it's got to be with an objective professional, an objective person outside of your situation.
Totally agree. So are there any other common mistakes that you see parents make, of course, with the best of intentions, but that come up time and time again? I can think of one, which is, you know, trying to tell the children about the other person's wrongdoings. But I'm sure there's many more. So I'd love to hear from you in your experience from speaking to people and your own personal experience.
Yeah, 100%. So I think there are two major mistakes. You've already touched on my first one, and I often quote, talking badly about your co-parent shows a disrespect for your kid. But on the flip side, showing respect for your co-parent shows respect for your kid. Yeah. You know, your kid doesn't want to hear that you think that their other parent is a narcissist. I'm quite strong on this word narcissist. It is being thrown around quite a lot now. And I think, you know, being a psychology graduate and actually understanding the DSM-5, it's not statistically correct that all these people are actually like textbook narcissists. And, you know, you're entitled to think that, and they may have certain traits, but your kid does not need to know that. So I think, you know, again, keeping those adult themes between the adults, but also not speaking negatively about your co-parent, because you've got to remember that is 50% of your child. And when you say, I hate your father, you're saying, I hate 50% of you, or that's what that kid is hearing. And I'm purely speaking from lived experience. Number two is, I find that one of the most common mistakes is that co-parents avoid having those difficult conversations. And trust me, I empathize with how difficult these conversations can be. But let's just start with the most basic, telling your kids you're getting a separation. You know, I think we've both done work in this space, Chloe, and you know, there are very clear ways to go about it, and I think there's a lot of guidance for it nowadays. But the amount of people I understand that have just skipped that part, or, you know, glossed over it, or had one conversation and not in an age-appropriate manner necessarily. That's one of the most common mistakes I find, is that theme of not having those conversations is then trailed through that kid's entire childhood, or that kid's entire journey of their parents' divorce, and they're never able to properly deal or understand their position in this world because of that.
Yeah, and there's an implicit message as well, which is, you can't really talk to us about this. The door's not open for that conversation. And actually, children have a lot to process during that time, and they need to be able to speak to their parents and to get the support they need. So if they don't feel that it's a topic that can be approached, it becomes very difficult for them.
That's exactly right. And I think the response I sometimes get is, well, my kid doesn't want to talk about it, and I sometimes respond, again, from lived experience, just because your kid isn't saying something doesn't mean they're not feeling it. And at the end of the day, you are the parent, they are the child, and you need to lead from the front, and you need to role model what it is to communicate effectively and
Yeah.
communicate within a family unit, whatever that family unit looks like. And if you're listening to this and you're like, oh my God, I've stuffed up, I'm that person that doesn't have those conversations, it's never too late. It literally is never too late. I have a lived experience with somebody whose parents divorced when they were in their 40s. And they're having these conversations now for the first time in their 50s, and they haven't had those conversations throughout their childhood, throughout their early adulthood, but they're starting now, and that's okay too. If you're listening now, if this is any encouragement, you can start now and have those tough conversations.
And so beyond those conversations, which can be very uncomfortable, but again, if you're focused on your child's well-being, you got to get over that. How else can parents support their children during the divorce itself, but also afterwards?
Again, I think one thing I often say is that divorce is an ongoing process. It's not just an event. It happens and then we move on and nothing, is talked about again. From the kid's perspective, accepting your parents' divorce is an ongoing process. I had to accept my parents' divorce when it happened. I had to accept it again when I was going through various emotions as a teenager and my life was impacted by it, but my parents helping me out with custody, helping me out with my logistics, helping me out with my schedule. That's how they were able to support me. But then when I had to accept it again, when I then, got into a relationship myself, how does my parents' divorce impact my relationships? Assistance through that, being able to go to my parents and speak about love and speak about these really vulnerable topics, and them not actually making it about their divorce, but about what I'm experiencing. I think parents need to realize that there is their divorce and there is their role as a parent, and they are not one and the same. And just because your life might be somewhat significantly impacted, and I'm not disregarding that whatsoever, doesn't mean that your entire role as a parent should be influenced by your divorce. You still have a role to be a parent outside of that. And I think that is one of the major kind of perspective and shifts that I encourage parents to do, to be able to be there to support their kid beyond the event of their divorce.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's actually the continuity element for the child. It's not because their parents are getting divorced that they stop being their parents, that they stop loving them. And you can say those words, but actually if you act in that way as well, it's very clear that that impact is not going to be negative on the children. So from your perspective as a child of divorce, how much do the children need support from their parents versus professional support?
Yeah, so I think I'm a very big advocate for professional support and for reaching out and asking for help when it's needed, and everybody understanding their boundaries and understanding the extent that they can actually assist. So I really struggled growing up where I needed to talk about my parents' divorce and how it was impacting me, but I felt as though the only people to talk about it was with the people that were causing my issues. So I remember going to mom and saying, I want to talk about something, but it's actually about you, and I need you to be my friend and not my mom. And how should a kid be in that position where they, feel that guilt and that responsibility of, I don't want, to take away my mom's happiness and say, I'm struggling because of something that you're doing. And I think times have changed since, and obviously it's not been that long, but since I was growing up, and school counsellors are always a good place to start.
Yeah.
You know, it's a comfortable environment. It's a age appropriate environment. These people are trained professionals, and you want to be your kids' be all and end all. I get it. That's how I believe my parents felt, but in a way, you're not allowing your kid to fully heal or fully understand their position in your divorce if you don't necessarily bring an objective person in, if that's what they need. I'm not saying that every single kid needs professional help purely because their parents divorced, but allowing that opportunity or having those discussions or just letting your kid know that there is help out there. Or, you know, social media is rife. My page, my Instagram page is for kids to know that they're not alone, to feel seen and feel heard. You know, it's bite-sized content, it's age appropriate. You know, just encouraging something like a follow or hey, I saw this video and look, this girl struggled with her parents' divorce, but she loves her parents. You know, it's not like a we hate parents page. It's a let's help her get through this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it's difficult for parents even to accept that they're not their child's crutch and they're one person to go to. And actually, what I often tell my clients is as long as they're speaking to someone, it can be a teacher, a coach, it can be, you know, a friend, their boyfriend, girlfriend, anybody, but it's just as long as they have somebody they can speak to. It may not be their parents, especially when they're teenagers, but they need an outlet and a safe place to express those feelings. And so if you're focused on your children's well-being, and as long as they're getting that support, that's all you need to be looking for, really.
That's exactly right. And I'll finish this little topic with one thing. With when there is fear, there is no love. And I think that there is often fear around this topic because parents think that if they're not confiding in me, then they're confiding in my co-parent. And therefore, they're going to love my co-parent more.
Yeah.
And I'm fearful that I'm going to lose my child and the connection with my child to my co-parent. And there's this competition. And I think coming back to that point where there is fear, there is no love. Your love for your kid needs to be greater than your fear that or your competition with your co-parent. So getting them that help is really making it about the kid and not about your conflict with your co-parent.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, actually, around that competition that tends to set in between the co-parents, even with regards to new romantic relationships, etc. And sometimes you see children being kind of put in the middle, either used as messengers or being interrogated by one side or the other to gather information on what's going on in the other household. Is that something you've experienced yourself or something you've seen with people you worked with?
Yes, again, very much so. And that is a really difficult topic for me because there's nothing really in me that can recognize any good out of that. I think, you know, the constant feeling like you're in an interview when you've just gone through a really difficult event, such as pick-up drop-off, which is already anxiety-provoking, very much big emotions. You get in the car and then it's, what did you do? Where'd you eat? What did you eat? Who was there? You know, those types of questions that are innocent and understandable, and I can empathize with parents, but that's just not age appropriate, one, and two, it's not fair. Your kid isn't, you know, in charge of how your co-parent parents. Again, keep the adult talk between the adults and do not put the responsibility onto the kids.
Yeah, spot on. So last question, because I think this is quite an interesting topic, is the difference in ages. And how you address things. You mentioned age appropriateness, and that's, of course, really important. What are some of the major differences you see between different age groups? And then I have a subsequent question, which is, what do you do when you have children who are from very different age groups? You've got a teenager and a 5-year-old, for example, and how do you handle that, even just the announcement of the divorce? But yeah, it'd be really interesting to get your point of view on that.
Yeah, well, look, I always say ages and stages. It's really important to understand at what stage your kid is in their life, what is age appropriate. You know, for example, we'll see different behaviors from different ages and stages. We'll see defiant behaviors in toddlers by, you know, they might increase wetting the bed, they might want to co-sleep, they might, you know, have significant anxiety around separation, or they might be more emotional and it's really unclear, or different eating habits are changing up. But then, you know, you look at a teenager and it's more withdrawal, or it's more, yes, anxiety, but dealing with it alone, or, limiting communication with mum and dad, or, divergent behaviors that, they might not have been participating in before, but now they're not with such good friend group because they want to rebel in a sense. So there's definitely different behaviors that occur based on the ages and stages, and how you react to that as a co-parent is really dependent on your understanding of where your kid's at. And it's really important that you're mindful of where your kid's at, and it's not a blanket, this is how you tell your kids you're getting a divorce if they're 5 or if you're 15. It's really important to understand what they need and the level of detail, for example, that they need. A 5-year-old doesn't need to know everything, but a 15-year-old might have about 6 questions that they want to ask you, and you need to be ready to answer those.
Preparing for those questions. I mean, I always talk about it. You know your child better than anyone else, so you know what their concerns might be, what kind of questions they're going to ask. Because of course, the typical ones that come out, it's important to be prepared for what your child's likely to ask. So to make sure that you're not caught off guard, but also to make sure that you don't get emotional. When you're not prepared, and if you feel a bit triggered by your child's question, it can be really difficult to answer it in a calm and reassuring manner for the parents.
That's for sure. Yeah.
I was going to say, how do you handle the announcement part when you have children of very different ages? Do you recommend splitting them up and speaking to them individually in an age-appropriate way, or still speaking to them together, ideally, but in a kind of manner that works for everybody? How do you usually approach that?
And I think this is it's a loaded question in a sense, because there are so many contributing factors that go into what you end up doing. And I think that what people need to understand, it really depends on your unique circumstances and where you're at. I think before I can answer that question, one thing I always recommend is presenting a united front as a co-parent. Obviously, that's not necessarily going to be absolutely possible in a lot of situations. Sometimes, say present a united front, and a co-parent would be like, in my dreams. And, so it's like, okay, can't do that part, next. And, then it comes down to, how are you going to deliver the news? Is it going to be at dinner? And I often say, do not combine it with a happy memory or a happy time. You wouldn't tell your kids you're getting a divorce at Christmas. They're going to associate Christmas and, oh my God, my parents told me the worst news ever at the same time. So when it comes to siblings, like for example, my brother and I were a couple of years apart, but we were at very different developmental stages growing up, I believe. When our parents divorced when I was 3 and my brother was 1. So I don't know if they necessarily delivered the news to my brother, but I vividly remember a conversation I had with my dad. And it is something that you need to understand will stick with your kid for quite a long time. And sometimes giving them a comfort, whether it be a sibling, to know that they're not alone in it, for me is something that I definitely would have valued. And when, that is true. But when we're talking about ages and stages, it is important to say, okay, let's do it based on the lowest age. That is the most appropriate thing. So you wouldn't, if you had a 5-year-old and you had a 15-year-old, you're gonna deliver the news in the most age appropriate way for the 5-year-old, because the 15-year-old's going to understand what's being said. But the 5-year-old's not going to understand the 15-year-old's delivery.
And then again, you're going to have follow-up conversations. So the 15-year-old might have more age-appropriate conversations afterwards to ask their specific questions in another context.
That's exactly right. And you just, I always say the standard needs to be the youngest child's, age appropriateness, but also not saying, okay, so the conversation's done, that's it. It's then saying, okay, little 5-year-old Sammy, you can go play now, because you don't really, need to process this too much right now, but you might in years to come. Okay, 15-year-old Nora, let's talk. Do you have any questions? Is there anything that, I can help you through this with?
That makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioned your brother. How important is that sibling relationship? Because I remember my daughters feeling very close because they were always moving together. They were the only constant in each other's lives, whether they were with me or with their father. Is that something that you've experienced as well?
Incredibly. I feel like I'm answering all your questions with 100%, 110% yes. My brother, to put it into context, is the closest person to me. I'm married now. I guess he comes second now, but he was the man of honor at my wedding. I didn't have a female best friend. It was my brother because he is genuinely the closest person to me. And in his speech at my wedding, in every speech I've done, it's always been, we've been through it all, me and you Cooks. Like, I call my brother Cooks. And he, knows that I know that because we went through it all together. I found it really difficult, and I still find it very difficult when parenting schedules involve siblings going at opposite ends between two homes. So I view that in a way that it suits the parents so that they're not childless. But in my very honest and advocate for the kid way, I want to express how important that sibling connection is. Even if they fight like cats and dogs and say, I hate my brother. Yeah, that's normal. Again, they're going to be normal kids. Like, let's not take that away from them. But having that person, and this is not to say that anybody who's listening and only has one kid and is feeling really sorry for their kid right now, I hear you. But if they do have the blessing of having a sibling, allow them to feel less alone by going through what they're experiencing together.
Yeah. Even if they're not really talking about it. I don't think my children talk about the fact that their parents are divorced or their feelings about it. But having each other, that's a really a huge asset in life.
Completely. I don't think my brother and I, we are good communicators now, especially as adults, and, loving our parents very much. But growing up and going through, I think, the hardest high conflict time for my brother and I, it was a look that we gave each other, or I'd hold him while he was upset, he'd hold me while I was upset, but it wasn't necessarily words. It's that deep, deep connection that parents will never understand that goes on between two siblings.
I love that. So we're ending on a positive note, and I think I guess if there's a silver lining, it does create a solidarity between the siblings and then a connection that lasts forever. Thank you so much, Bella. It was so nice to have you, and such interesting tips and information you shared. For those of you, those of the listeners who want to reach out to you, how do they reach out?
Yeah, so you can subscribe to my blog at www.akidwithtwohomes.com. There's a contact form there and a subscription to all the new blogs and news. You can also reach me on Instagram at akidwithtwo homes. And there's lots of valuable content there for kids and co-parents.
Yeah, great information on your website and on your blog. And what I love is that it's targeted at the children mostly, so children can go self-serve and get that information. Thank you so much, Bella. It was great to speak to you.
Thanks so much, Chloe.
Have a good day.